The American dream is the concept of rags to riches, and our culture has made the terms success and wealth synonymous. But this definition of success doesn't necessarily bring happiness. According to the Happiness Planet Index, America isn't even on the first 100 countries listed with an HPI of 37.3. This is what we will be discussing this morning on this edition of Good Morning Chappaqua. A good example of Americans trying to use wealth to bring them happiness is the novel The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. In this novel, the upper class of Long Island in the 1920s is shown through the eyes of Nick Carraway, a moderate middle-class man. Nick becomes good friends with his neighbor, Jay Gatsby, who is known for his extravagant parties. Gatsby doesn't attend these parties, though. He usually spends these drunken gatherings in his office. The reason he has these parties is because he is hoping that Daisy, Nick's cousin and Gatsby's past lover, might wander in. He thinks his wealth will impress and therefore help him win over Daisy. Daisy needs to be loved and finds comfort in the money of her past boyfriends, including Gatsby. Although Daisy is married to a man named Tom Buchanan, she still gets back together with Gatsby. Throughout the novel, the reader finds out about the adultery that Tom is already committing, and the intertangling of these relationships begins. None of the characters end up happy in the end, though, with the married couple's lovers both ending up dead and the couple retreating back to one another. As you can see from Fitzgerald's novel, the reality is that wealth cannot make people happy. Regardless, our country and government still put way too much emphasis on money, and have done so for all of our history. Some historic examples of this include the relocation of Native Americans and the U.S.'s involvement in the Philippines. Since the first settlers landed in America, we have been pushing the Native Americans back. In 1830, it became a law. The Indian Removal Act allows the president to have ownership of all Indian property east of the Mississippi River. Under this act, the Indians would be repaid with new property taken from public territory west of the Mississippi River. The Supreme Court ruled that this was unconstitutional in the Worcester v. Georgia case, but President Jackson decided to ignore this ruling. So how did Native Americans get to their new home? In 1838, the first party of Cherokees that had initially resisted removal started the march westward to new lands in present-day Oklahoma. Their entire race would follow them on what became known as the Trail of Tears. On this trek, thousands of Indians died of hunger, exposure, and disease. All of this suffering so that we could have more land. In the late 1800s, the Philippines were a Spanish country. The U.S. said that we were going to help the Filipinos gain their independence while we were fighting Spain in the Spanish-American War. Filipinos fought alongside Americans, and we won their independence for them. But after we had won, we just took them as one of our colonies. The Philippines were an ideal trading location. In 1899, when the Filipinos realized that the U.S. was not going to give them their independence, the Philippine War began and lasted until 1903. It was a brutal war on our part. 4,200 Americans were killed compared to the 100,000 Filipinos killed. Americans put them in concentration camps in which there was rampant rape and execution of civilians. All of this suffering so that we could be closer to Asian markets. And our focus on money didn't stop in the early 1900s. It is still extremely apparent today. Eric Schlosser's book, Fast Food Nation, sheds light on the modern fast food and meatpacking industries. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA's, regulation of the meatpacking industry is not nearly extensive enough, giving the companies enough leeway to extremely abuse their workers. They pay them low wages for long hours of painstaking, sometimes lethal work. Then they lie about it to OSHA. After the meat products leave these terrible factories of pain and suffering for both the animals and the workers, they arrive at the fast food restaurants. These fast food corporations also deny their workers' rights, specifically the right to collective bargaining. The companies, such as McDonald's, only care about making the largest profit possible, underpaying everyone from the farmers to the cashiers. You might be asking yourself, why don't our representatives take care of these problems? Most of their constituents are being affected negatively by these practices. That's because the representatives are funded by these companies. The Supreme Court case Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission made this legal. This case stated that corporations are people because they are a manifestation of a group of people, and that money equals speech. This meant that corporations could use their right of free speech to have a virtually unlimited ability to give money to representatives in order to influence campaigns in their favor. Now, the representatives have to vote to benefit their funders instead of their constituents for fear of losing their funding. So how does this affect everyone? Well, while the wealthy are getting wealthier, the poor are still poor. The cycle of poverty locks people into the social class they were born into. People born into slums and poverty are likely to stay there their whole lives because of factors such as high crime, bad living conditions, limited education, and a lack of adult role models. And how does living in America affect people emotionally? According to Healthline.com, the number of people diagnosed with depression increases 20% each year. And beyond that, 80% of people who experience symptoms of depression aren't treated for them. And then there's the people who take action on these feelings. In 2012, suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in America. Someone died every 12.9 minutes from committing suicide. And this isn't just a bunch of poor people killing themselves because they're poor, even though if you make less than $34,000, your chances of committing suicide increases by 50%. But even if you were to make more than that, the suicide rates decrease only marginally. Suicide rates are actually higher in wealthier neighborhoods. Someone who lives in a higher income country is 4.5% more likely to commit suicide than someone who lives in a low income country. Although I do admit that you need money to survive and buy clothing and food, etc., the amount that the wealthy are demanding is extremely excessive and unnecessary. The government needs to switch its focus from money to the happiness of its citizens. Since our country defines success as wealth, and the wealthy provide funding for government representatives, governmental decisions are made to benefit the rich primarily. But this wealth can't buy happiness, and at the same time, the poor are unhappy because of the cycle of poverty. If the government were to make it more difficult for the wealthy to control the representatives, then they could impose reforms that would decrease the focus on maximizing commercial profit and increase the happiness of all citizens.